this all should be therapeutic in a way of like you're working through whatever complex things in real time in front of people. It's like a very vulnerable space, but then like letting people into that vulnerability is like how we actually get work that resonates with people and like work that matters to people. Whereas like all of the very heady technical technique things are like, those are cool to like the people who are studying the thing and like, oh, rad, cool. But then without like the humanness behind all of the stuff, it'll kind of just like, that's the ceiling. That's like as far as it'll ever get.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey there, greetings, and welcome to the show today. If you're new to the podcast, I'm glad to have you here. My name is Tyler. I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, a podcaster. Generally, I'm just a guy who loves to make things, and on this podcast, I sit down with other makers to discuss their artistic journeys, creative processes, philosophies, inspirations, pretty much whatever it is that makes them who they are. If this is your first time listening, I hope you'll go back and check out some earlier episodes because there have been some really fantastic conversations so far. Oh, and if you're a returning listener, it's really good to have you back here. On today's episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by Phong Tran. Phong Tran is a Brooklyn-based composer and visual artist, primarily working in digital and electronic mediums. His work revolves around emotional experience in digital and non-physical spaces. Phong's solo work has been released through New Amsterdam Records, People Places Records, and slashsound. I've known Phong for around a decade now, and he's one of those people who I have been able to witness in real time just about a distinctive artistic evolution in the coolest way possible. We'll dig into that during this conversation, and he also shares what led him to dive into electronic music in the first place, how he views composition as a form of journaling and even therapy, and why creating emotional space in his creative work is so important. This is a fun and also thought-provoking discussion that I'm so excited for you to check out. Before we jump into this conversation, as always, I just have to share a little bit of business. One of the simplest and indeed the best way for you to support this podcast is by listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and also following the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device. Shout out to the Patreon fam. As of recording this episode, we've got 20 amazing Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible, and you can join them, support what we're doing on Patreon, and you'll get early access to episodes by becoming a subscriber for just $5 a month. That little bit of support goes a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools I use to produce this podcast. I also just launched a new Patreon exclusive feature called The Workshop, and that's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some current composition projects I'm working on. You can find a Patreon link and other ways to financially support the podcast on our website at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. Finally, perhaps the most impactful way for you to help the Music Maker podcast, and by the way, it's free to do, it's to leave a rating and even a review if you're able to, if you feel so inclined. And the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we are able to grow. So you can do that, or if you've already done it, just spread the word. Tell some friends that we exist. Now, on to my conversation with Phong Tran. Well, Phong, I've really been looking forward to sitting down with you to talk with you about your work and your journey, because I think the music that you make is, it's simply brilliant. So I just want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me. And thanks for the
Yeah.
nice words.
Yeah, of course. So, our usual starting point here on Music Maker is as far back as you can remember and care to talk about, and that is, what is your earliest artistic memory, either as a composer or just a music maker in general?
I was thinking earliest music memory, just in the abstract, and for me, that's like rewinding my old Power Rangers cassette as a kid.
No, that's cool. That certainly counts. Yeah.
It was like the first like physically or like physical object of sound that I had. But a lot of like my early music memories were on my parents' piano. They got an upright piano and got lessons from my two older sisters. So I remember them playing the piano, but then I was like too young for them to also put me in lessons. And then that was while we were living in Canada, just around Toronto. And then we moved down to Georgia and we brought the piano with us. And by then it like zero maintenance, horribly out of tune. I remember the F key, like F4 was just sticking constantly, but I just ended up teaching myself piano on that after learning how to read sheet music, playing trumpet in middle school. But like figuring out how to play the piano on my own was like pretty core memory for me. And then just learning a bunch of anime tunes and like video game songs and stuff like that, just on that by myself, felt really nice. Yeah.
So when you say you were learning it on your own, did you have like a book you were learning out of, or was it like going to the internet? I mean, this would have been maybe like the quasi early days of the internet. Not the early days, but I'm guessing maybe like 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, this was like early YouTube, before anyone was doing like YouTube tutorials of anything. But we kept my sister's old beginner piano books, so I was starting from there, and I had already learned to read sheet music from school, so I was like, okay, this kind of makes sense, I think, and it was just like slowly connecting dots and like sound to fingers and that kind of thing. Because middle school band was where I actually started music, but I don't think it really progressed into where I wanted to be until I got to the piano.
You were playing video game music, anime music. That's something I really relate to, actually, because I had like we didn't have a piano until I think I was in middle school. I started taking piano lessons not long enough to get me like through college piano class, though. But at any rate, my first keyboard instrument was like almost like a Casio toy keyboard kind of thing. And yeah, I remember kind of doing the same stuff, maybe not necessarily coming up with my own music, but emulating the music from these cartoons or anime or video games that I really loved. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that kind of core seed is what led me to end up tinkering, and that tinkering led me to arranging and then composing. Do you feel that that's the case with you? I mean, or did it just kind of stop with like, I like playing this music, and then composing came a little later from somewhere else?
Oh no, that's like the exact trajectory. Like that's such a direct pipeline.
Okay, I
Like
spoiled it for everybody.
no, but that's what you do. Yeah, I definitely remember like downloading the free version of Finale, and then I can't remember the website now, but there were all these like transcription files, and this is how I would find all the anime sheet music and stuff like that. But then I was trying to like move back from the piano to the trumpet, which was like my primary instrument, I guess, and trying to do my own transcriptions for that using the piano as like the starting point. And then that turned into how I figured out how to use notation software and all this stuff. And then that turned into like, oh, okay, what if I just started like writing my own stuff? And then, everyone writes like that first super corny, cheesy piano piece or whatever, and that's like, okay, cool, we've gotten that off.
Yeah, yeah. The Opus 1.
Yeah. I was like, oh, I was so proud of this, and I'm like, oh, this is so cringe.
Yeah.
But that's where we go.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, a lot of the people I talk to don't have the same kind of band experience that you and I have. I actually started out playing trumpet in middle school too. We're like the same person, it sounds like. And we like forked off at a certain point a little bit. But yeah, I started playing trumpet and then I switched to the euphonium, which of course there's like no future in unless you want to be in the military or teach at a college. So of course I ended up gravitating towards composition. But do you feel, I mean, I really felt like, especially the music we played in middle school almost was so much like that music I really loved in the media that I consumed, that I think that was an important kind of thing for me to encounter at that age, 11, 12 years old as a little trumpet player. Do you feel like what kind of music did you guys play in your band program? Because band is such a great place for contemporary music, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I remember playing a lot of, like, Vaughan Williams and, like, Frank Kelly and, like, all of the big major band composers at the time, and then I think, like, once I realized that I wanted to take music a little bit more seriously, I wanted to, like, dive into the repertoire and then realize that, like, the band repertoire only goes so far back because the ensemble is so new. I was like, "Oh, why aren't we playing any, like, Beethoven or, like, Bach or, like, all of the people that are like, "Oh, yeah, this is classical music." I was like, "Oh, it's good because it's all for the orchestra." And my orchestra or my school orchestra at the time was not the greatest.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
was like, "Huh, okay." And it was only a string orchestra, so, like, there was no way for me to, like, play any of that rep unless I was gonna go audition for ASYO. But yeah, I think that was when I started really, like, trying to think about music more broadly beyond what I was just, like, presented in front of me in band class and, like, the video games and stuff I was listening to, and that kind of opened up a lot for me.
How much were you composing at this point in your life? And I mean, were you able to hear it be played by people, or was it mostly limited to the notation softwares you were working in?
It was mostly just the notation and, like, whatever piano ability I could play on my own. Yeah, I didn't like, the thought of composing for other people hadn't really crossed my mind. I was really writing for myself, and then it really wasn't until undergrad that it was like, "Oh, yeah, you should be writing things for other people to play." And that's when I think things really kicked off for me.
Yeah. So when was your first encounter with a composer? Was that undergrad, or did you have a chance before then to meet a composer in real life? And I've also kind of expanded this question into being like, when did you first encounter the music of a living composer? But you've kind of already answered that with like Frank Kelly, I guess.
Yeah, I hadn't really met, like, in person any other composers until I got to college. And then most of that was, like, professors and stuff.
So you're in college in Georgia, right?
Mhm.
And are you studying composition at this point? Did you enter undergrad as a composer, or did it come later? When did you know you wanted to pursue the craft of composition as a career?
Yeah, I knew basically in high school, like, after I wrote that first piece, I was like, "Huh, there's something here. I feel like this is something that I could do." And I started pursuing that more, like, diligently, but all of the paths I knew to get to where I wanted involved a lot of performance elements. Like, I had to, like, if you wanted to be a comp major at the university I went to, you had to have a primary instrument, and to have like, be able to get through that, you had to audition on an instrument to become a composer, and, like, none of that really made sense to me at all. I was like, "But I just wanna, like, study theory and, like, make the stuff. Why do I have to spend, like, 3, 4 hours a day practicing, like, etudes and all this stuff to, like, be proficient on an instrument?" Looking back, I see the value of it. I definitely would have done a different instrument because I had to, like, slog through trumpet lessons for 3.5 years of my undergrad, and I'm like, "Why am I doing this? My face hurts."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I totally get it with the trumpet thing, because I was, I again, this is a major reason I gravitated towards composing. Was certainly you have to practice composition, but it's like
Mhm.
it's not as like a physically demanding kind of, if you don't warm up for 2 days in a row, like you're like a week backwards, right? On a
Yeah.
brass instrument. And so, yeah, I never enjoyed the fundamentals, the warm ups, the like getting into the practice room at 7 a.m. to start your day. Like that just wasn't me. And
Mhm.
so I, I don't know if I would say the same about like sprinting through it, because I almost didn't have a choice. We didn't have a composition program where I did my undergrad, but totally, totally relate to the things you're saying. And so I don't know, solidarity. So I'm always interested in hearing how composers such as yourself, who primarily operate in kind of digital and electronic mediums, decide on making that their focus. Because I feel like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when I met you, I've known you for about 10 years now, and certainly you were, I think, working a little bit with electroacoustic music, but definitely not to the degree that you do now. So I'm wondering, what did this journey look like for you? What, there, I feel like there was like, when I met you again, Phong, the acoustic concert music composer, and now you're like doing all this like really radical, awesome modular synth electronic kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you and I were like the two nerds at that festival that we
Yeah.
met at, like geeking out over lickety scores and stuff in the library. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, very much hadn't hit the electronics bug nearly to the degree that it is now. But at my undergrad, University of Georgia, there's a really amazing analog electronic studio, and this was like the prerequisite to getting to the digital studio that's like all Pro Tools and like all the microphones and recording equipment. But the analog studio was reel to reel tape machines, just like old school, like massive 64 channel analog mixer. I think like an ARP 2600 and then like a custom built 2500 system. But I was literally splicing tape and like
Wow.
recording and like, cool, here's how you manually patch like a ping pong delay, and like
Mm.
here's how you manually do a feedback, and like all of these different techniques that are just like a plugin now. So the whole time doing it, I was like, wow, this would take me 5 seconds to do if we were just in the other studio.
Yeah.
Like this prereq sucks. And then now looking back, I'm like, I want to be back in that studio so bad. I want to like physically manipulate the sound, cut the tape, put it back together, like play with all of those toys again. And that's kind of why I ended up diving so deep into modular, because that's the closest I think I'm getting to that same feeling of like there's something very physical about like patching cables together and like controlling where the electricity is going, and like this thing is telling this knob what to do, and that's like all in my system of control. And like the composition in that point is like the programming of this box that you've made.
Yeah. At the University of South Florida, where I got my master's, it was the same kind of sequence. Like there was a room almost identical to what you described, like the giant mixer, the big modular synth, a computer to record the synth into. I think there was a reel to reel machine, but we never touched it. Though that's also like a fascinating thing to me as someone in radio, because I do so much like editing and production work in radio. And the idea that like I've worked with people and maybe still work with people who remember having to cut the tape for the radio. And it's like, that's like, and then they're asking me for help in a DAW. It's but yeah, I thought that the sequence from like the analog modular synth, and then it, you did like digital electronic music, and then the endpoint was real-time electronics with like pure data and MaxMSP. I feel like there's a lot of people who jump into like MaxMSP right away without that hands-on modular analog experience. And I just have to say that having, and we didn't do it extensively, we just did it like a day or two out of the whole semester, which is kind of a bummer, but like having the physical logic of that in front of you, and then going into MaxMSP, for example, like a software, makes it so much easier to figure out what you're doing. rather than just like dropping in objects and, kind of just going with the pre-built kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I think like even just like the simplest thing of figuring out how a patch bay works. It's like, okay, get this sound to come out of that device, go. And then like once you know how that works, it's like, oh, Max MSP is easy.
So after you graduated from Georgia, you went to NYU, and did you continue this kind of work through your masters? I mean, what again, I feel like there was this like very much a transformation in your work that happened after you got to New York City. And I'm just
Mhm.
really curious about what that looked like.
I was doing a lot more DAW related stuff as like earlier electronics, just working in Ableton the first couple years of New York. But I was still very much like classical composer, writing string quartets, like chamber pieces. Had like an orchestra reading that kind of went nowhere.
As they usually do.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of that experience both reinvigorated like my passion for making electronic music while also kind of like disillusioning me to like just how things work in classical spheres. Like I wrote a piece for I Care If You Listen recently that talked about like thoughts on the commission model, and a lot of that comes from like my experience in New York and being like, why aren't these two musical disciplines, performing and composing, more integrated into each other? And the fact that like it seems like composers and performers are kind of like a snake eating its own tail in a lot of
Mm.
ways of like why can't we both just do both things, and instead we're kind of like in separate camps but both dependent on each other, but then also both cannibalizing the same resources. So that pushed me into like, okay, I need to start developing a performance practice for myself because I can't always be expected to like one afford to pay performers all the time if I'm ever going to have pieces performed. And then I also can't expect to have performers commission me if I'm going to like have work. So I just need to be pretty autonomous and have my own kind of self-contained system where I can explore and make and like just do the thing without worrying about who's funding it, who's performing it, what's happening. It's like no, I just need to make stuff, and that really came to the forefront after I graduated, and suddenly like, oh, I don't have access to like their music library for scores. I don't have access to all the performers that I would have had just from being in a university. So yeah, that really pushed me to like, okay, just like practice and be on stage. Yeah.
I totally feel it. And I was actually talking with another composer the other day about what you're kind of describing. They were describing the situation where they had two kind of sets of performers wanting to commission her, but like apply to one of those big commissioning funds together, like where you have to go in as both a performer and composer together apply. And she was like, I'm really having a dilemma on this. I don't quite know what to do. And the discussion ended up being like, why do you have to wait for these institutions to provide you the funding to make this music that you both want to make?
Mhm.
Like, but also, are they willing to pay their own money to commission you? Like, it sounds like they're not if they're waiting around for this, and it just kind of puts everyone in like this icky situation, right? And I'm glad you brought up your article because I read that, and I love what you suggest about like looking towards the visual art world where there's like patrons commissioning people instead of like the community commissioning one another.
It's not like these ensembles don't want to like pay composers from their own money out of pocket. It's probably because they don't have that money lying around. It's
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
no one has these resources, and it's like, oh yeah, it would be great. Like if I had the money, I would be throwing it at my friends to be like, yeah, let's do cool together. Let's go. But we don't have that. And we're like beholden to these institutions or whatever. So then I think that's Another part of the issue is, at least within the community, it feels very, like, egocentric in a way of, like, yeah, someone should pay me to, like, do the grand thing that I wanna do, and, like, just give me the money, and, like, I wanna make the thing that I wanna make. It's like, yeah, we do need that to an extent of, like, this is how we get actually cool new ideas and, like, work that wouldn't exist otherwise, but there also comes to a point of, like, "'Kay, who is this work actually serving? Who is this for? What does this do for the community around us besides, like, the ego of the artists who are making it?" And I think that's, like, a big thing that's missing, especially in new music, where it's just like, "Okay, who why did this need to exist?"
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think the problem you're describing, we're all kind of navigating that in our own ways. And I think the solution that you've come up with yourself to just basically be self-reliant, you're still making great art, you're making a career out of it and all this stuff. And you don't have that same reliance on either institutions or your friends having to throw money at you, like you said. Again, we all wish we could do that, but we live in a capitalist hellscape, so we can't. But we're kind of getting into the weeds here with, I don't know, the cultural and societal issues of new music, and also a little bit with electronic music. But you have composed plenty of acoustic music, for acoustic instruments, I guess standard classical music instruments, for lack of a better word. So I do want to be clear that you don't only make electronic music, but what is it about non-acoustic music that helps you achieve the work that you aim to create? And I guess also when you do incorporate acoustic instruments into your work, and I'm thinking the most recent piece that you wrote for Adrian London Dixon, which I really love, for violin and electronics. How do you do so while maintaining the digital musical identity that you have established for yourself?
I think it does go back to, like, ego. Like, whose voice am I trying to be in service of? So, when I'm working purely electronically, that's when I get to be, like, my most authentic self. Like, I very much treat that as, like, a sort of journaling process. I'm purely expressing, like, what it is I'm feeling in whatever moment, or, like, communicate an idea for either, like, a specific person in mind or, like, a specific group of people. Like, with Computer Room, it is, like, it's dedicated to all of the people that I grew up with on the internet. Everyone that's ever been on any of my friends lists. It's like, "Yeah, this is for you. Thanks for
Yeah.
making me who I am." But then when I'm working with someone like Adrienne, or, like, right now, I'm doing a consortium with Andy Hudson, it's less about me and more about, like, cool, what are we all doing together? Like, the artistic entity isn't me and then a performer. It's like, no, 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 it's both of us together. So I wanna know, like, alright, what does Adrienne, like, crush it in? Like, what does she do exceptionally well? What emotions is she going through, and how can I relate to that? And, like, what can I kind of channel through all of this? And, I mean, I think for that piece in specific, we were both kind of dealing with the same thing of, like, a global pandemic. Sure, there's nuances and stuff, but, like, the overarching theme is, like, yeah, we're stuck on our computers and we're alone. So, that was pretty easy for me to channel into that, into a way that, like, felt good in her hands, and, like, give me the sense of trust that, like, she would do an amazing job with that.
So I know that in working with performers, sometimes that looks like sitting in a room and saying, can you do this on your instrument? Can you do it's almost like from a technical point of view, like, let's be technicians here and let me write something that's like that you do really well technically. But and I'm sure that you do that too, but it almost sounds like you're just like hanging out almost and trying to get like the vibe of the emotions that you and your collaborator what's going on there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think technique for the sake of technique's sake, especially after working so long with computers and electronics and like, I can make like the craziest runs just like go with zero effort. Technique isn't as attractive to me anymore with technology. Like flashy sounds are cool, but it's not as impressive as like an emotional thought or like a clearly communicated idea. And this was a big learning moment for me in I think the last piece I wrote in my master's, which was for our mutual friend Miki Sawada.
Yeah.
I wrote a piece for her called Rotations, solo piano piece. It's hard.
Yeah,
It
it's
is,
intense.
yeah. And Mickey like kills it on the recording. I remember when she played it live, everyone was just like, "How is she doing this? What's going on?" It's like, great, amazing. So like, holy crap! I'm like, yeah, I don't have words for it. But then I remember talking to her like years after, and was like, "Oh yeah, I that piece made me lose trust in you." And I'm like, "Oh no." Yeah. So like, yeah, the piece was great, but it was definitely like a piece that should have been for synth and keys, and this was before I'd gotten that deep into electronics and realized that's what the actual sounds I wanted to make. That like, oh yeah, I don't need to force another human being to do this to their bodies and spend X amount of hours practicing this to make them do this to their bodies. It's like, right, yeah, these are people. Like, people have more to communicate than just like, look how many hours I spent practicing this thing.
It's an interesting balance because, sometimes we wanna explore those realms, right? Like, we wanna get into the nitty-gritty and stuff like that, and I feel the same way. I've written pieces when I was younger and maybe less mature of a composer. I've written pieces for people where are they good pieces? I think so. Did they get performed well? I think so, but it's like, clearly there was, like, a miscommunication between me and the person just because I don't know if it was, like, we didn't know each other well enough or we didn't spend enough time getting to really know, like, what is this project gonna be? But I think, yeah, I think what you're saying about you can now explore that really kinda heavy technical, not necessarily heavy, but, like, when you do feel like doing more technical music, you can rely on the computer instead of a human, and the computer is not gonna lose trust in you until AI gains sentience over us, but that's kind of an interesting balance, and it's
Yeah.
something I've never really thought about.
There's that, but then there's also like I found it's easier to let human virtuosity shine through when I'm out of the way. Like the performers know how to navigate their instruments with fluidity and mastery that I, as a composer, will never 100% grasp because I didn't spend years on that instrument.
Right.
I only know like theoretically what the thing is, but like having performed my own instrument and knowing its ins and outs, like I wouldn't ever expect anyone to like notate for me a thing on my instrument better than I would just be able to like do like intuitively. So a lot of that is just like, hey, yeah, you do the thing. You just like do this thing that I know you do and just do it
Yeah.
instead of like
Yeah.
play this like these 16 bars like the way I wrote them. It's like no. Let me like figure out what the emotional space and the idea is and I will let you be you.
Do you feel like, most of the music you write now, when there's a performer involved, and in turn, most likely an acoustic instrument, do you feel like you're always doing that in tandem with electronic music? And if that's the case, how do you think about that balance? How do you think about the way that those two kind of disparate things serve one another in your music?
I mean, the way I've been thinking about it more recently is like if I'm not performing live with them, I tend to treat like the electronics as setting and then the live performer as character. So that's like exactly how Adrian's piece works. I'm like, this thing is just gonna go and it's gonna be like, this is now the room that you're playing in. This is the ambient space of the room. But you're in control of where we go in this, and you're the one telling the story in this space. Like, sure, the environment will change and you're responding to that environment, but ultimately it's like the active person in front of the audience is kind of the core idea.
Yeah, I like that. And I think it plays into like the virtual worlds kind of idea that we'll touch on in a second, but or maybe now. But one of the questions I always ask people, and it it's really it has to do with like your creative philosophy. But what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
I think it comes down to like architecture and emotion. It, it's it's like, what am I feeling right now, and who am I presenting this to, and like what am I trying to say to that audience, and then really dissecting that emotion and feeling and whatever that idea is, distilling it down to like its absolute simplest shape. Like, is it just like a line that goes up? Is it like a layer of like interrelated curves and stuff or something? Like, getting it to its most abstract point where it's still generally recognizable as that feeling or that emotion. And then I use that abstract seed as like a Rosetta Stone across all of my other stuff, where it's like, cool, how does this manifest visually? How does this manifest in like a bunch of synths, or like unfolding over time as like a musical idea, or like literally anything else? I think that, yeah, like being able to distill something down to its core essence is like the biggest thing.
You spend a lot of time pre-planning this architecture that you're describing? Because I know for myself personally, like every piece begins with like a blank sheet of paper that I'm like drawing on. I'm to get the narrative of the piece, an idea about that. So when you talk about architecture, are you doing stuff like that?
Yeah, it was like that for a while, and then now it's moving. Like, it's like a weird feedback loop that I have to go through of drawing out stuff, or like improvising in an emotional space and just like feeling out a thing, and kind of going back and analyzing what I just did, like listening back to the recording, like, okay, these features, these kinds of things, this is like actually the thing that is speaking to me in this space, and then reducing that back out as like an analytical idea,
Yeah.
and then going back into like, okay, how do I keep that as the seed and then re-explore that back out, and that is like the loop I go through.
So like earlier you were talking about composing as journaling, and like now it's like it's all starting to connect for me.
Great.
Like the way you're describing it. That's really awesome. And you mentioned that you, in addition to music, you do visual work, and I was hoping we could talk a little bit about that. Can you discuss your interests in graphic design and the visual elements that you use in your work? Because it's not just like graphic design. There's video elements and all kinds of you do all kinds of stuff. Did this interest begin separate from your music making, or did it kind of arise out of composing in some way?
I think it did come out of composing, in like a like logistical way, but then also in like a very intuitive way of like my early pieces were definitely very much drawing graphs, drawing diagrams, drawing like, okay, does this like sequence of lines or whatever that I have as like representing my form, does this make sense? And then I would just like draw more of them, and like,
Yeah.
cool, this is now like a weird visual thing, and like bad visual art, but still visual art. And this kind of tied into a lot of how I treat scores. I'm also like an engraver and editor as like my day job ish sometimes, and that feels very much like, cool, this is like everything needs to be in alignment. This is like how the notation communicates this idea in like the clearest way. And there's a lot of times where I'll like look at a score, like this could be notated better. I'm sure we all have. It's like, yeah, there's
Yeah,
a better way to write this exact thing that doesn't need like a nested tuplet into a nested tuplet.
right.
But even earlier than that, I think in undergrad, our composer studio kind of treated itself and operated like a club, even though we were like, oh yeah, these are it's literally just a club of all of the composition majors,
When you say club, do you mean like almost like a clique or like a literal like student organization?
like a literal student organization.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
That's what I
So
figured.
then I got tasked with like making all of the posters for everyone's recitals and concerts and stuff like that. So that was like very early intro into like practical graphic design, and then that spun out into, where I am now, like designing shirts and making, like pretty straightforward graphic design content, and then exploring into like 3D art and like animation and all of that stuff.
Like you're starting to like I'm starting to see more and more of your visual art on like album art,
Oh yeah.
like from our peers, their releases, and I'm every time I see it, I'm like, that's a Phong piece
Oh,
because
great. I'm glad that
it's
I have like a
yeah,
style coming through. Great.
yeah. So how does like clearly, when I see your visual art, there's a direct correlation between that and the music you make, especially the electronic music, like where it's it's almost like I don't even know how to describe it, but the direction I want to go with this, and I mean this in the best way possible. It's like living inside of a computer. And I'm just wondering, like, how do those two things inform one another? Like how does your visual art and your music kind of cross pollinate?
I think it is the fact that I'm going in both practices, going to that like core essence of an idea thing, where it's like there's if you strip away all of the details and all the flourishes in like both elements, it's all pretty simple lines and directions, and like everything is pointing towards a thing. And I think I operate under like a, is the thing that we're experiencing going to a place, or are we at a place? And that's very much like I treat that visually and sonically. I also spend a lot of time trying to think about form in a way beyond just how musicians conceptualize it. I spent a lot of time talking to like painters and asking them about that. And they're like, "Oh, form to them is space. It's proportions in space." I'm like, "Oh, that literally makes perfect sense, because I for us that's proportions of time." It's like, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, cool." So like the things aren't so distant as they appear to be. It all just kind of feels the same extension of the same thought.
And again, like they both capture your artistic identity really well, I feel like. At least I don't know, like I don't give it a second thought,
Great.
You mentioned it earlier, and I'd like to talk more about your album, The Computer Room, because this kind of sense of nostalgia that you talk about when you describe this album, like on your website, for example, or in the liner notes for it, longing for the computer room of your youth. It's something that I really relate to because, I was on like AOL Instant Messenger and messenger boards, and like it was just like a big part of my youth, like growing up. So, how did your early days in your family's computer room go on to influence your music?
It was just like a cultural thing that really just informed a lot of my taste. And like the kind of art and culture that I had access to was heavily rooted in like the online communities I was in. I don't know, like talking to people like Aaron Satian and Andrew Noseworthy, like they both, like these are two of my best friends from my master's program, but they both grew up around like very hardcore emo communities. Like they had those physical proximity to these cultural scenes. And I grew up in like the suburbs of Georgia. There wasn't a whole lot of art going on. There wasn't a lot of like easily accessible things I could grapple with in my community, so I spent most of my time on the internet. and that led me down to like playing StarCraft, and then that led me down to like watching Korean esports, and then finding other people who were into that and like finding the music that they listen to, which was a lot of like what's EDM now was like trance and techno and all of that, but then also very early generations of like K-pop and J-pop.
Mm.
So then all of that kind of morphed its way into the things that informed my taste even now as an adult. I'm just like, oh yeah, this feels familiar. This feels like a thing. Like this has very much informed my taste.
Yeah, I grew up, and I still am, an only child, and that hasn't changed. I grew up as an only child, and so I'm like a very introverted person. I think because of that, I kind of had to like make my own fun, and I think for me growing up, the computer was like the ultimate companion, and so I very quickly, I had like a Super Nintendo and a PlayStation, for example, but I quickly discovered like MMORPGs, and then it's like, oh, I can play video games with people from all over. I think the one that maybe a lot of people, I don't know if people still play this or not, like RuneScape,
Oh yeah.
like, and actually only really one other person that I went to school with growing up really was into this kind of stuff. I mean, I had all kinds of friends, through band but one friend in particular, I'll give him a shout out, Jordan. Jordan Wright, he was also into all this stuff. And weirdly enough, he's the only person I still talk to that I grew up with. But yeah, he was like he was also a component in like helping me. He was sharing like music with me and like torrented anime episodes that we like you couldn't get here in the United States and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I just think it's really, I mean, it obviously shaped who I am in a lot of ways, but nowhere near to the degree that it's like shaped your music. And so I think it's, again, I talk about this all the time on this podcast with people, including Andrew, who I had on about a month ago or so, about, this internet age that we grew up in, which is far different than what it is now in a lot of ways, was such a beautiful kind of thing, like it helped us connect with people and places that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And I think it's just really awesome that you've made a whole album about it.
It's like a fun little like time machine to like think back on. It's in a way that like we're always online now. It kind of feels like we're not actually there anymore. Of like being online was like a conscious, active choice that you had to be in like at that time. It's like, oh, if someone was online on your AOL friends list, there's like, oh yeah, they like showed up to the hang. They're there and you can like talk and hang out with them, but then like cool, they gotta go do something else. They're offline. Cool, they're done. That's
Yep.
like that's good. you know? So it's like everyone was choosing to be an active participant, which was really fun.
Yeah, I remember at that point, now we're just like talking,
Just in
waxing
nostalgia zone.
nostalgic. um, I remember like, this was at a time, at least for me, certainly before iPhones and before cell phone, like, I would have been like 12 or 14 or something. I didn't have a cell phone, but I had AOL as instant messenger on the computer and I could like instantly talk to my friends. And I remember being at Walmart once and seeing like a device that would let me do that away from the computer. It's like a texting device,
Mhm.
and it's like thinking about how badly I wanted to be able to do that at that age. And now it's just like a given for everybody. Like you can
Yeah.
instantly like talk to anyone from anywhere in the world. And in a lot of ways, it's like, no, take me back to before that was a thing.
Mhm. No, I definitely remember being like a very late adopter on texting.
Mm,
Like I didn't get a cell phone even until I think like my last 2 years of high school, and then even then it was like phone calls only, no texting.
yeah.
It
Yeah.
was very that, but then I like gradually noticed like less and less of my friends were online on AOL, and I was just like, "Oh, okay, I guess the party's dying down." because everyone's moved on to the cool new thing, and I'm like, all right, I'll see y'all later.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we should bring it back.
Yeah.
I'm sure it
Oh yeah. I
exists.
mean,
It'd
it's
be
Discord's
weird
the
to
closest thing we've gotten to that.
Yeah. Yeah. So shifting gears kind of back on track here a little bit. You're fairly active in presenting your music at shows and in front of audiences and whatnot. And it seems like an interesting juxtaposition, I guess, with your work, which is often inspired by or even occupies the virtual spaces we've been talking about. So can you discuss this a little bit? I guess philosophically, how do you bring your music into quote unquote real life? Because it almost seems to me somewhat related to like augmented reality
Mhm.
in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I don't necessarily think I think about it in that way. Like I kind of view my performance practice actually as something like almost a third discipline away from like my composer producer brain and my visual artist brain. Performing just feels entirely different, and I'm constantly trying to find ways to like how do I integrate all the different personalities here into one
Yeah.
thing? And I'm making progress towards that. But like I think like my performance is very much in the same vein about emotional spaces. Like everything I do is about creating an emotional space either physically in a space or like in time. It's just whatever mode I'm working in at the current moment. But yeah, I think it's all it all comes back to like what is the emotional thing I'm trying to communicate and what am I trying to make you feel and experience and let you inside my brain for a little bit.
I almost hesitate to ask this question because it can get into some like personal space very quickly, but I'll just kind of ask you and you can speak however you choose to. But what do you think draws you to this focus on emotions?
It's the thing that's been like the most challenging for me, I guess, in like the creative process. It's like one of those things that's like final boss mode. Like let me figure out how to understand and work through this. And it's a boss that'll never die because we're constantly like emotions are forever complicated. But like I think that was in undergrad in my master's program, like all through school, it was the logic and the technique of composing. Like that was the hurdle you had to get through. And I was like, cool, this is the thing you can teach. This is the thing that like this is what I'm here to like study and learn to do. And then I did that. And I'm like,
Right.
cool, I've got a good handle on like how to technically do all of the things and all of the whatever. Now it's like how do I use all of the things in my toolkit in like in my inventory to like get over whatever emotional hurdle is going on in my life and like express that and communicate that. So yeah, I don't know. Did that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, actually it's an interesting thing for me to think about too because as I was going through high school and undergrad, well, I'll back up and I'll say I've always been a pretty like sensitive person and emotional guy even though I think, I'm like a giant and I have a giant beard and I have a pretty crunchy exterior, but underneath it all is like kind of soft and goopy. And so a lot of my early compositions, I wanted to feel something from writing them, like emotions or convey that in some way. And it felt to me like going through grad school, especially like you're saying, like it's focused on logic, technique. It's all good stuff. It's all stuff that served me extremely well. But I kind of lost that little bit of essence in my own music as well. And it's interesting because I find that we're always trying to grow as composers and strengthen and further our artistic practice, and so I'm always kind of critiquing the work I've already done. And for the past while, I don't even know if I could put a number of years on it, but I look back at my music and I'm like, it's missing something. There's something missing here. And maybe it is what you're describing. Maybe that's my final boss too, or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's everyone's final boss. I feel like it's like, I don't know, this all should be therapeutic in a way of like you're working through whatever complex things in real time in front of people. It's like a very vulnerable space, but then like letting people into that vulnerability is like how we actually get work that resonates with people and like work that matters to people. Whereas like all of the very heady technical technique things are like those are cool to the music nerds. Those are cool to like the people who are studying the thing and like, oh, rad, cool. But then without like the like humanness behind all of the stuff, it'll kind of just like that's the ceiling. That's like as far as
Yeah.
it'll ever get. Like no one's ever like, I don't know, cheesy, but I unironically love clapping music. I think it's a really fun piece. I think it's great. But it's like I'm never gonna cry to that piece. Like no performance of that piece is ever gonna make me
Yeah.
like feel something so
Yeah.
deeply human. It's like, but it's a cool piece. Cool, good, great.
How do because you mentioned like we've talked about the classical nerds. I guess you and I are both we fall into that category. But
Oh yeah.
I'd imagine that you've presented your music to classical audience, so to speak, or classically informed audiences maybe, and also people who maybe aren't so much in that world. What kind of responses do you get with the music you're describing? Do you feel like you connect with like the general populace more because you're focusing on these things?
I try to. I like because I do want to write for them. I feel like I don't know. I'm not trying to exclude or do anything like that. But I do think like the classical audience maybe just like they can pick up on the nuances more just because they have more experience just like listening more actively to a thing. But yeah, I don't know that there's really a big distinction in my head on how either camp is reacting to it
Yeah.
because I think they're both reacting more to the emotional side of things that I'm trying to communicate than like all the technique and whatever.
Yeah, I hear you. What is like an artistic artifact, like a piece of music or a song, a book, a piece of art? It can really be anything like that that changed the way that you thought about your work and perhaps even like changed your creative trajectory.
Mhm. As far as music, I think it was R+7 by One Oh Tricks Point Never, like that whole album. Because at the time I had been that was like purely classical mode. Like this is like I'm in Sibelius, I'm a capital C composer, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And then listening to that and like how he treats MIDI artifacts as like, oh yeah, this is just data. Everything is just sensory input data and like the re-expression of that is mutable depending on how like what other things you're putting on post MIDI. It's just a MIDI clip. That's all it is. This is just what and that really goes back to like, cool, what's the core essence of the idea? And then what are all the ways it can spin out and be expressed as like into different mediums? And that kind of like I think that was the seed that planted that idea in my head. And then more recently, I played a video game called The Beginner's Guide by Davey Wreden. It's the same person that made the Stanley Parable. This is like his follow-up to that game, but before doing like the Stanley Parable remaster.
Mm.
But it's all a series of like I think it's like 10 to 12 like 2-minute games max. And the entire time there's a narrator going on that's like explaining all of the games to you because each of these games are supposed to be made by a friend of the narrators who's kind of like dealing with some difficult emotions and like going through a rough time. So he's trying to showcase his games, but then the entire time we're kind of like getting a portrait of this deeply disturbed person and like the issues they're going through. And I'm like, wow, this isn't a video game. This is like an art piece.
Mm.
This is just straight up like
Yeah.
like it's a like a avant-garde art piece that you have to like literally walk your own way through and like physically engage with. So that's been informing a lot of like how I'm thinking about like my own practice and like ways I can kind of combine all of my different brains together and all the different personalities into like a single thing.
What does that look like, you think? Like, what is, because I was thinking about this earlier when you're describing these 3 different hats that you wear, I guess,
Mhm.
so to speak. I mean, what would the ultimate expression of that be like?
I mean, right now in my spare time, I'm dabbling with like just straight up making a video game. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
nice.
like beginner's guide was like something that like on its surface, like each individual game is extremely simple. Like it's not like deep mechanics that you have to like master or anything like that. It's like, oh yeah, you walk from point A to point B, and then the act of doing that, it's so poetically powerful and profound. I'm like, okay, that yeah, this like demystifies the idea of like a video game as like this monolith that I think we get from like these like AAA studios, and like even like a lot of indie titles are like huge now. So it's like it's nice to see something that can be so stripped down and still very impactful. And that was something that's like, oh, I can give this a shot. I've already like given so many other mediums and disciplines, and this kind of seems like, oh, I already have enough of the related skills to do this. I just need like the last little key to the puzzle, and then it'll be a thing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, you're part of the duo Media Queer with Darian Donovan Thomas,
Mhm.
which is a project that explores your 2 intersectional identities as queer artists of color, as well as each of their intersections across creative disciplines. I'm quoting your bio on that because it's put more beautifully than I can come up with. So I'm just wondering, how did this project begin, and how does it differ from some of the other work that you do?
So we started, I think, 2018. I want to say Darren and I met through the New Amsterdam Composers Lab, uh, which is I want to say like 6, 7 composers basically meeting up on Zoom every month to like talk about. It feels like like anyone who doesn't know what genre they neatly fit into, it's like a
Mm.
support group for those people.
I love that.
And yeah, so that's how I met Darian, and this was right before he moved to New York, and then he moved here, and we just like hit it off and became really close friends, and had a lot of overlap on like just the way we thought about mutability across different mediums and platforms and all of this stuff. So we decided to like collaborate on a bunch of things together. And I think how it's different from my own work, like it's a weird thing because Darian and I both, because we have our hands in so many different things, it's very easy for us to like, cool, I'm gonna go do my own thing, and like I can like be completely self-sufficient. And then it's a totally different thing when I like open up to someone else who is exactly the same in that way of like, oh yeah, he can also do like literally all the stuff and like be totally self-sufficient. And then it's just the way that we both think about things is very opposite, but like we're both on the same goal, but we'll go about it completely different ways. The running joke that we have between the two of us is that he's very Charles Xavier and I'm very Magneto. But that's just like how we both look at art and like our music and our approach to everything. And it's been really helpful to like get influence from him and his thoughts and ideas on things, and vice versa of like, oh, here's how like I would approach the thing that you're struggling with. It's very much like, I don't know. I feel like band or ensemble is, I think, very like one-dimensional way of thinking of what we're doing, I guess. I think it's more just like we're really close friends and we both are into a lot of the same stuff, so we're like, cool, here's stuff to think about.
So, of course, you guys are playing in front of people, but it really sounds like maybe I'm picturing like the glacier meme or the iceberg meme where
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like the tip of the iceberg everyone sees like a performance with Media Queer, but really it's all the stuff below the surface that's making a big difference in your practice, in Darian's practice, and in the music that people ultimately hear you two make.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of funny that like if you look at the MediaCore Instagram account, I think the last post is like from 2019 or something, because neither of us really want to keep up with the account and deal with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
We have our own socials to deal with. But then like if you go through our messages, a lot of it is like, hey, here's this idea for a thing. Is this bad? And it's just like that back and forth. Or like,
Yeah.
here's the thing I'm working on. Like, what do you think? Should this? And it's just like us giving feedback across a bunch of other things. Like, just because we know and trust each other's tastes on so many different levels of like just art.
Yeah, I was interested in it because I think for so many people, they view composer, capital C composer, as like a solitary figure making music. And certainly that is the case most of the time. But it's always interesting to me to see composers who collaborate with one another, because that's something that I haven't quite experienced other than like in a classroom setting, for example. And I don't know if it's for me, but it's I don't know what you're describing. It sounds like a great, I don't know, space for ideas and everything. Support.
Yeah. I think we've accidentally like formalized something that's super informal, and then everyone else
Mm,
sees like the slight degree of formality that we've put onto it. It's
mm.
like, oh, this is like an organization thing, and I'm like, no, we're just vibing. We're just two friends hanging out, and we're doing stuff every now and then, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, which is totally valid.
yeah, yeah,
It doesn't have to be formal.
right. We just like making cool stuff with each other, and that's kind of all it really is. Yeah.
So I have to ask you, because we haven't talked since this happened. Because when it happened, my wife Susanna and we were like, "Whoa, this is incredible." You were commissioned to make a graphic score for like a companion book, I guess, for Everything Everywhere All at Once, the A24 film, which is a movie, if anyone hasn't seen it. I left the theater and I was like, "This is a perfect film."
Yeah.
It's like, and then we saw that you were commissioned to make this thing for like a companion piece for the film, and we were like, "Fong's kicking ass. That's awesome." How did this come about? Like, what was this experience like? I'm just like, out of my own curiosity, I want to hear about it.
Yeah, yeah. Everything Everywhere All at Once immediately was my favorite movie of all time. Like
Yeah.
hands down. It also it came out like 2 months after I'd come out to my mom. So
Mm,
then I was just like,
yeah,
uh
that's heavy.
deeply relevant, deeply
Yeah.
like I had never seen myself presented on screen in any more of a way than it could have possibly been. So being able to do this was like mind blowing. But Darian, he's played with Ian Chang through Moses Sumney's band, and Ian Chang is also the drummer for Sunlux, who scored the movie. So they approached him and told him about like all of these companion book things, and then Darian immediately knew, was like, no, this needs to be a project that like Fong and I do together. So he brought me in, and we like toyed around with designs, because one of the pieces that I for sure knew I wanted to do was Everything Bagel, because I was heavily dealing with depression at the time. Like I was going through it, and this was like the biggest catharsis moment I could have dealt with it. And the whole time, I think we Darren and I both have a focus of like, who is the audience that this thing is for, who is like, for any piece that we're working on together, for any like anything, it's like, who is this, who are we actually trying to reach and communicate to? And for these companion pieces, it's just sheet music. It's just a sheet music book that people can kind of just like play along with, like for like, it's a piano songbook. So we knew that like no one's doing a recital of these pieces. No one's like going on stage and performing any of these pieces. So that's like a typical audience is not actually the audience we're thinking of. The end audience is the person who's playing. So what is like the emotional experience that we want them to have while they're going through our arrangements. So a lot of it is like, cool, here's like an extremely simple reduction of like what's going on in the score, like the original score. And then the whole time we're gonna prompt you to like think about the other realities that are happening with you and them, and like imagine these other worlds while your hands kind of like go into autopilot doing this thing, and just kind of like immerse yourself into this experience. And then for the everything bagel, we decided to just like we toyed around with making like an actual playable score for this, and then it kind of just we just kept thinking, and it's like, no, this just needs to be a purely visual piece, and we just like
Yeah, yeah.
we just made it purely visual. It's like that's all it is. That this is just you sitting at the piano looking at this thing, and that is what that became.
Yeah, that's awesome. We've talked a lot about audience today in some really interesting ways, at least to me, but what you're describing is maybe the most interesting in that I've never heard anyone talk about an audience being the person playing the music by themselves. And I think that's a really poetic and beautiful way to think about music. And I admit I haven't seen the score because I don't want to give A24 all my money. but but that's like I'm thinking about the ways in my music that I kind of indicate mood or character or emotion, and it's like almost like that to the like the most extreme level. So I don't know, I just have to make a comment about it. it's that's just really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like even for me as a performer, there's something about just like when I get to a keyboard and I'm just like noodling and just like doing a thing, and I just have to like almost meditatively like go into a place just doing that. But then knowing that like, oh yeah, if I was doing this in front, like if I was doing this in front of an audience, I would like be cringing. Like this is horrible, awful, 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 awful. Like the most boring thing. But like the physical act of doing it for me is like so much release for that. So like there's value in like guiding someone else into that practice of like, yeah, you can just be here and let yourself make whatever sounds come out and just like feel that space.
Yeah, that's so good. Kind of getting into my final set of questions, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't making music, if it wasn't your art, if all the visual art and graphic design was out of the equation, even the engraving work, what do you think you'd be doing?
Oh, I so all through undergrad, I was also double majoring in microbiology,
Whoa,
and
okay.
like the plan was pharmacy school after undergrad, and then I got into NYU and was like, cool, I think I'm dropping all of my science classes now. It was very much like straddling two two very different tracks, and then like it came to a point like one or the other. So very, yeah, very that. I would have been a pharmacist and probably hating life right now, but also I would be struggling with money a lot less. So who knows?
It's the trade-off, right? Do we do the
Yeah,
most fulfilling thing to us and we're maybe a little more poor because of it? or,
yeah,
or are we miserable and making a ton of money,
yeah.
do you feel like those studies in microbiology, do you feel like that has made its way into your music in any way? Maybe not recently, but I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. It has me thinking a lot about like interconnected systems and how everything plays together. Like I remember, I think it was like the first or second day of my intro microbio class. The professor pulled up like this massive flowchart of every chemical reaction system in your body. That's like, here's like sugar being broken down through the Krebs cycle, or I think that's or is Krebs cycle plants. I don't. It's been so long. However, like glucose is broken down to make ATP, and then all of the branches and pathways that goes into like controlling your nervous system, controlling like pancreas levels and like your sodium potassium balances and all of this stuff.
Mm.
Like everything is so woven together and related that like changing one thing on one part of the chart like has like a downflow across all the other stuff. Um, so just thinking about that had me like really fascinated about like, cool, how can I play with that like creatively? And that kind of is still like a lingering thought when I'm working through like counterpoint ideas or like the thing I'm like wrestling with now is trying to make a visual form of counterpoint that plays with music and space of like, cool, this musical idea is moving across like this much time. What's the ratio and proportion that like this visual idea needs to move to like feel related to this, but also feel like it implies an independent direction that's like working with and against this thing. Just a lot of systems at play.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Is there a tool that you use in your practice? I'm sure there's a ton of tools that you use in your practice, but is there one that you think everyone should know about that could just like they could pick up and benefit from using?
Uh, I think a journal. I mean, I've been going back to journaling a lot more recently, but like the ease of composing kind of comes from the fact that you can hit Command S and like, cool, this is the work I've done today, and I've saved this progress, and like, cool, I can like go back and revise and edit or whatever. But then when you're practicing, you don't get that. When you're like just thinking about an abstract idea, you don't get that. You like like it's either in your hands the next day or it's not. And I think journaling has helped me kind of like cement just general thoughts and ideas down in a way that feels like hitting Command S on my brain. Just like, cool, save state logged. We can like move on and refer back if we need to. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, very that.
For me too, yeah, like the writing down of things has become vitally important because I have so much going on and trying to juggle all these different things, and I'll just have like a fleeting thought pass through my brain that's like maybe about a piece of music, maybe it's about the podcast, maybe it's about like my radio show, and I'm just like, if I don't write this down somewhere, even on a post-it note, and put it away,
Mhm,
I'm never going to remember it. Or conversely enough, maybe I don't write it down, and if I do remember it, it's worth it's worth remembering. I don't know. So
mhm.
there's a balance there.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a thing to like orient yourself in time, I think. Like it's to plan ahead of like, cool, this is all the stuff I want to get done in the next like week or so or like in the next couple hours or whatever and just like make sure that I'm getting it done, but then also sitting back to like reflect on the past 24 hours of like, okay, what actually got done and like what did I actually end up figuring out, and actively writing out what your ideas are helps you flesh out and like really understand what it is that you're working with beyond just like, oh, this was a cool idea. Like, no, what does this mean? What is this like how is this connected to all the other things I've been thinking about? And like a long period of reflection feels kind of necessary so that way you don't spiral into like, oh, I haven't done anything. Like I feel like I did stuff, but I didn't really do stuff. And you're like, no, you probably actually did a lot more than you think.
Yeah.
And it's all a continuity of the things that you did yesterday and the day before that and before that. It's like having that physical log of what that is, it kind of keeps you sane of like, yeah.
And even just recognizing that, yes, if all you did was cook a little bit of something in your brain, that's enough. That counts.
Yeah.
That's productivity. We're trained so much to like we have to produce something for it to count, and it's like no,
No.
like I don't have to compose every day to actually be composing. I can think about it in my brain and
Right.
have simmer it some.
That's the thing. Like people don't think like thinking is work. Just like write down what you're thinking as you're thinking it, and it's like, cool, that's great.
Yeah,
Command S.
that's it. That's it. So my final question, and feel free to answer this as broadly or as specifically as you'd like. And that is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
Oh, I mean, it might be presumptuous, to say this, like especially where I am in my career right now. But I'm starting to feel more and more like, do you remember how, well, not that like there's like a physical memory attached to this thing, but like photorealism as an idea in painting became like immediately obsolete once photography came around.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like we're witnessing that happen to purely abstract music in the current day, of like purely abstract music in the moment. It depends on something else to kind of orient itself and give itself meaning. Otherwise, it is just like, cool, these are just pretty sounds. Great, A plus. But like for it to have emotional weight, for it to have, I guess, meaning to us as people and not like just like conceptual thinkers, I think it does need some other degree of context and element to it. And I think that's where I am reaching with like everything. Like that's kind of why I'm reaching into visual art, and now with like 3D art, and eventually like making a video game for all of this stuff. It's like all of these things, like I don't want them to feel like so disparate and disjointed. It's
Mm.
all one contiguous expression of an idea, and like the music is just a single facet of it, but all of the things are contributing to the whole, I guess that's where I am with my art right now.
Well, Fong, I think you do it really well. And if you have concerns that you're not doing it well, I mean, don't be. It's
Thanks, that's good to hear.
I not that I'm like, the ultimate arbiter of things, but like I said before, and I mean it, everything that you do is so clearly connected in such a well thought out way that what you just described is, I can't help but agree, it's good stuff.
Thanks. Means a lot to hear.
Yeah. Well, Fong, this has been great kind of catching up a little bit and learning more about you. And just once again, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show today. And I'm going to keep on the lookout for all the stuff that you do. It's
Yeah.
all good.
Likewise. Thanks for having me. This has been so much fun.
I absolutely feel like all of those thoughts from Fong on audience and composing as therapy and journaling, super powerful stuff that I continue to think about ever since we recorded that discussion. Just some really great stuff there. Phong can be found online at fongmusic.com. I'll have a link to his website in the show notes and show description. And it's completely worth the visit to check out all of his visual work there, in addition to his music. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com, and that's where you can find some episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support the podcast and network. That's all I've got for now. Can't wait to connect with you for the next Music Maker, and until then, take care.